Hello and welcome to this brand new Blender Smoothie tutorial. In today's tutorial we're going to be creating grass. Now I know it might sound kind of boring to some of you or kind of uninteresting, just especially because there have been so many tutorials released on this subject. But this is something that I've been working on pretty much since I started using Blender. And so I have a couple additional ideas that might make it look a little more realistic or a little more interesting. I'll let you decide that for yourself, but anyway, yeah, we can get started with that then. So I'm just going to delete the default cube, and I'm going to delete the lamp too, because we're using the Cycles render engine, so we're going to use mesh lights. And before we go any farther, you'll notice that there are tabs on the side here, which sort of gives away the fact that I'm using a test build of the next version of Blender. I guess it depends on what time you're watching this, whether that matters or not, but for those of you who haven't updated to the newest version yet, since technically the official one hasn't been released at the time of this recording, we're not really going to be using these tabs anyway, so feel free to ignore them. It's just kind of distracting. Okay, so I'm going to add a plane, and I'm going to scale it up 8 units. So that's just S8, just so that it's the size of the grid here. It doesn't have to be the size of the grid. That's just a nice size to start with. And the first thing I'm going to do is kind of give this a little bit of variety, a little bit of randomness, so it's not totally flat. So I'm just going to go into edit mode, subdivide it, bump up the number of cuts to, I think we'll do 12. And then I'm going to come down here to the fractal option and adjust that a little bit, just to give this a little bit more variety like that, so that it's not totally flat. And don't be afraid to go like too high, because we can always scale it like down along the z-axis or whatever later on if you want. And we are going to be giving this like a level 1 subsurf modifier, so even the highest peaks won't be as high as they are right now, because they're going to be smoothed out a little bit. So I'm going to press tab to go back into object mode then, and set the shading to smooth, come over here to the modifiers panel and add a subsurf modifier. And we'll just keep that at level 1. It doesn't really matter too much, but on the off chance that some of the ground is sort of visible, then it does help a little bit. And I'm going to move that up. I just pressed GZ to move it up along the z-axis a little bit, just so it's above the grid. Okay, now we've got that set up. Typically what we would do from here after adding the shader to the ground and everything is we would go ahead and add like maybe particle hairs using the particle system. But in this case we're going to be using objects and scattering actual mesh objects across the plane. So we're going to be creating a couple grass blades, then maybe even a couple dead leaves or weeds or something else to go along with it too. But before we do that, let's quickly give this ground plane a shader. So I'm going to press N to open the properties panel, and I'm just going to name this ground. Close that, and then I'm going to split my view again. Not again, I haven't done that yet, but I'm going to split my view, and I'm going to switch this upper view to the node editor. And I'm just going to add a new material, and we're going to call it dirt or something, doesn't matter. You can do this a couple different ways. You're not really going to see it very well, so you could just make it even a dark brown color with maybe a little bit of color variation thrown in with a noise texture, and no one would be the wiser. But in this case, I am going to use an image texture. Just to make it a little more realistic. So I'm going to go to Textures, Image Texture, and I'm going to open a texture that, it was my grass textures right there, that I downloaded from cgtextures.com, and I'll post a link to that in the description of this video and on my site. But it's just a really simple grass, sort of dirt and grass texture that we can use for the ground plane. We've got to actually UV map this though, so I'm going to go ahead. Actually, I don't need to do that. I can just open this. Alright, yeah, so split your view again and open the image editor, then load the image, and then we can go into edit mode over here on the plane. Press U to unwrap and project it from view. We should be able to go into textured view since we have it set up in the nodes up here. And so I'm just going to scale that out a lot so that it's not repeating too much, but we don't want it super blurry. And that's pretty good, maybe even a little more. Okay. So we can combine those two windows then, and probably want to add a light before we go any farther so we can really tell what we're doing. So I'm just going to press Shift A, add a plane, And I'm going to move this really far over here because we're trying to simulate the sun, essentially. So we want to move this plane really, really far over, and kind of want it to be sort of high like that. And maybe we can even scale it down a tiny bit more, just because we don't want a really big lamp, because the bigger the lamp is, the softer the shadows are, and the sun casts pretty sharp shadows. Okay, so I'm actually going to name this sun, just so we don't lose track of it there. And I'm going to add a new shader, call this light. We'll probably actually just call it sun, it doesn't matter. And should probably be doing this in here, and just delete that and add an emission shader. Merge those. And I'm going to make this complete white. I'm going to drag this all the way up to the top and give it a little bit of a yellow tint too. Then we've also got a little bit of work that we should probably do on the background as well, meaning the, whoa, what did I do there? Try to center that. Okay. Yeah, so if we go into rendered view right now, then you'll see, well, first of all, it's still really dark because we've got to increase the strength of the sun to like 1 million practically. We'll try 100,000 first. That's pretty good. We need it brighter though. Maybe 150,000. We'll start with 200,000, and I'm going to leave it at that. We'll probably end up tweaking that later, but for now that'll work. Then we want to go into the background and sort of change this as well. So we just want sort of a dark blue, just something like that can kind of fill in those shadows a little bit more, like the sky would. And this is just going to be sort of a test render type thing. I'm not going to put this in a scene or anything for this tutorial, so we don't have to worry about like the color of the sky. We would probably use a background image of some sort to get an actual image of the sky. Because in order to get the brightness and color of the shadow right, then the sky has to be extra dark, and it looks kind of weird. But in this case, it doesn't matter. Okay, so we've got a pretty good ground plane there then, and a decent lighting setup. We'll probably want to tweak it a little more later. Really quickly, before we move on to the actual grass, I just want to give this a little bit of bump mapping. So I'm going to go to Converter here, add a math node, connect that to Displacement. Connect the color output from this node into the value in here, change this to multiply, and now when I adjust this factor, this value here, it should adjust the bump mapping. So we see if we put this all the way up at 1 and zoom in a lot, you can see the bump mapping really taking effect there, and if we put it at 0, there's none. 0.5 will probably be pretty good. Yeah, so that'll work. Okay. I'm actually going to lower that even a little more, probably 0.35. Okay, I'm going to save this before we go any farther too, and I'm going to save it. I'll just save it in that grass textures folder. So let's name it grass tutorial 1. Okay, so now we can move on to the actual grass blades. So I'm just going to sort of drag this up so that it's kind of out of our way for a little while, and I'm going to select the sun. That's why we named it sun, so we could find it easily. Not that it really matters because we only had like 2 objects in the scene, but still. And I'm going to duplicate this, pressing Shift-D, and I'm just going to right-click so it locks it in place there in the exact spot it started out. And I'm going to press M, and I'm going to move it to another layer. And the reason I'm doing this is just so that we can sort of work with it without having to hide the ground plane or anything like that. Just a totally new setup in here. So I'm going to add a plane, and what we're going to do now is we're going to create the grass blades. So I'm going to start by scaling this in really far, something like that. Alright, and basically what we want to do once we have that set up is scale it in along the x-axis. Again, that's just S, X. Is we want to go into edit mode and add a couple edge loops by pressing Ctrl-R, and then I'm going to scroll up with my mouse wheel once. So we've got 2 additional edge loops in there right now. Once we've got that, you'll just right-click so that they're locked into place. And then we can deselect those, pressing A. And using the box select tool, we can just sort of select some of these, press S and scale them in. All we're doing is creating a simple grass blade shape. So we'll just select these and scale them in, select them and scale them in. Actually, that's really thin. I'm actually going to scale that out a little more, something more like that. Maybe go back into object mode and scale it in along the y-axis a little bit. Okay. And then we also want to do the same thing on the side here, so we can sort of bend them like that so they're not perfectly straight. And that's pretty good. We can click smooth there. The next thing we want to do... Actually, we should probably make all the objects first, and then we can add the textures. So I'm gonna name this grass 1. I'm gonna duplicate that. Just name this grass 2. And I might make this maybe a little thinner, just to give it a little more variety, and maybe bend this one down even farther. Because you do want varying levels of that, just so that it looks a little more random. Maybe I can duplicate that again and name this one grass 3. And then maybe we can make this one a little thicker than the other ones, and maybe also a little straighter than those other ones, something more like that. Maybe kind of like that. That looks pretty good. And then maybe one other thing we could do is add one more and delete the top, so it looks like it's just been cut off. We'll name this grass 4, and I do that often, just so we can add even a little more variety in there. And then we would want to give that a little bend too. And of course, these are all like bent in the same direction in here, but once we actually scatter them across the plane, then they'll be all going in different directions. The next thing we need to do actually is go into edit mode on each of these, select all of them in edit mode, and we want to move them up by pressing G, Y, to move them up along the Y-axis, and we want to align them, the bottom of the grass blade, with the object origin point, which is that really teeny tiny little orange dot that you probably can't see in the really small resolution on the video. I guess if you watched it in HD and went full screen you could, but it's just a little tiny orange dot, not a vertex, but a little bit bigger than that. That's the object origin point, and that's basically where we want to put these. And I'll do that on each of those, go into edit mode, select it all, and move it up. Assuming your cursor is in the center and everything, you should just be able to move all of these up so that they're resting on top of the x-axis, just like they are in here. And you just want to do that with all of them, just like that. And what that'll do, basically, when we put them on the plane, is these grass blades, basically the object origin point, the little orange dot, is where the grass blades will start to grow from. They'll start to come out of the plane from that area. So if we had it like it was before, where the object origin point was in the middle of the blade, then we would have like half of the grass blade above the ground plane and half of it below, and it wouldn't look good at all. So this is just so that the entire blade is above the plane. And, yeah, we should be able to split the view now if I press N to hide that. Kind of split that view. And we'll go into the image editor again. And I just want to load a couple more grass textures. Now, these ones are images that I took, and I will maybe attach them to a file, maybe put them up on my site, and you can download them from there. They're just two really simple images. And we're going to start with this grass one first. If you zoom in really close, you can tell it's kind of blurry and weird, but as a whole, it's pretty clear image texture to use on these grass blades. So I'm just going to start with this first one all the way to the left, and I'm going to tab into edit mode and press U, project from view, to unwrap it. And of course it unwraps it the way it is seen in the viewport, like it should. Actually, I wonder if I do that. Project from view. Yeah, that's better. Okay, that way we don't have to rotate it. So I just rotated my view so that this was angled in the same way as the image. Then you want to come over here and press S, Y, sort of scale it out along the Y-axis. And actually I'm going to rotate that 180 degrees. That was just R180. And I am just going to position these different parts, different areas on this grass blade. And the idea, basically we don't want to get any of this on the black surface that's under this. This is what we want. Just something like that. Should be good. We can't see it even if we go into textured view yet because we haven't given this a material. So I'm going to go ahead and do that really quickly and name it grass 1. We'll just name it grass. Yeah, that should work. And let's see here. Basically, we can work more on the shaders later, or the properties of the shader. Right now I'm just going to add a texture, image texture, and I'm just going to load that, drop that right in there. Okay, so now we can actually see what we're doing, and that's what's important. And it looks pretty good. Looks like it's mapped really well, and I'm not going to bore you with unwrapping all of the rest of these on the tutorial, so I'm just going to pause the recording, and once I'm done with that, then I'll get back to you. Alright, so we're done with that. Basically, I just used the same image on this second grass blade, and then I loaded my second grass texture and used those for these other two blades. Yeah, so that's all we had to do there. And basically, the next thing we want to do, first of all, I can sort of merge those, is we want to start working on the properties of these shaders. So, essentially, we're going to have a little bit of transparency, and not transparency, but translucency, I guess I should say. And we're also going to need to have a little bit of glossiness, because grass blades sort of shine a little bit, and all sorts of that. So let me see here. Basically, I guess we can just sort of build off this diffuse node here. The first thing we want to do, if we go into rendered view, which is the first thing we want to do because we need to see how these look with the sunlight that we have set up and everything. Looks kind of boring. I mean, they're not very shiny, like I said before. They're not very colorful, actually. If you look at them, they look kind of desaturated. So that's the first thing we should probably take care of. So I'm just going to go back into solid view here. And I'm going to move this down even farther, just so we have more to work with here. Move that up. Okay, the first thing I want to do then is I want to add a hue and saturation node, and I'm just going to drop that image texture output into there. And I want to sort of adjust the hue a little more too, because I think it was a little too green. I wanted a little more yellow. So I'm going to make this 0.45, which leads more towards the yellow end of the spectrum. And might be tweaking that later on, but we'll just leave it at that for now. I'm going to bump up the saturation too to maybe 1.5. And you know, maybe this would be better to apply to the translucent side of it. Because I guess it could work for the other side, but generally the grass looks more colorful when you see the sunlight shining through it. So that's what we'll do. We'll make this the translucent side. So in that case, I guess I'm also going to add a brightness and contrast node that we can work with, just so we can really tell those apart. And then I'm going to add a translucent node. We'll tweak these settings after we get a better idea of what this is going to look like. Then a mix shader, and we'll just combine those. And let's take a look at this. Okay, so that looks... Alright, so you can see now that because this is mixed at exactly 0.5, so 50-50, it looks pretty much the same on both sides. The only difference is this side is a little more yellow and a little more saturated, just because of what we did with this node here. I'm also going to adjust this just to see if we can't get sort of a little more brightness back there. That looks pretty good. So we just sort of want to tweak these values a little bit until we get something that we're happy with. That looks pretty good. Okay, so now we can really see that the other side is a lot brighter. I mean, not a lot brighter, but to a certain degree it's definitely brighter. I want to make that even brighter than that. Maybe try 0.4. Then bump up that contrast to sort of match it. I'm actually going to bump up the saturation to 2 while I'm at it as well. And you know, I think that's a little too yellow for my taste, so I'm going to go with 0.465 instead. Maybe even 0.475. And we'll just sort of tweak these until we get something that we want. That'll work for now. We'll probably mess around with it a little more later on. Then one other thing I want to do before we move on is we want to add another mix shader and a glossy shader, just so we can add a little bit of shininess to these. And I'm going to move that all the way up to white. And we'll have a roughness of like 0.075. We want it to be kind of sharp, but we want a much, much lower mix factor. Alright, and if we sort of get it in the light there, we can see it a little better. It's maybe too much roughness. I'm going to drop that to like 0.05, and I'm going to drop this glossiness factor to 0.005, maybe even 0.002. That looks a little better. Because we just don't want it too strong, is essentially it. And that's still really strong. I'm going to try 0.001. That's better. Okay, that'll probably work. Yeah. And then, I made separate materials for these other grass blades, but we can probably just go back here and reload grass 1. I'm just going to make that a single user, and we'll name it grass 2 again. And I'm just going to load another image there. Alright, and then we can load grass 2 again for that. Alright, and now they should all have essentially the same material. We sort of, yeah, they should all be transparent, not transparent, translucent. And that looks pretty good. I'm wondering if the 50-50 thing is really working. Might want to try increasing that to like 0.75. Oh, that looks better. Yeah, that looks a lot better. Okay. So basically all I did was I just increased the mix value of this. Whoa. Kind of bumped the microphone stand there. To basically give it more translucency than the diffuse. So I'm actually going to do that to this one too. Just kind of see how that looks. Because I think that does look a lot better. This looks a lot darker for sure. I think that'll work actually. That looks pretty good. Okay. Then we might want to kind of lower that a little bit too. Kind of try getting some of that a little more. Do the same there. Just because we're probably going to have to increase the strength of our sun lamp. If I can find it. Where did I put it? It should be sun.001. I don't know. Try 300,000. See how that looks. That looks a little better on the back there. Certainly much brighter on the front. And that's really what we're looking for. It looks like a pretty strong difference. But that is ultimately what we're looking for. I'm going to maybe drop that just to 0.6 on both of these. 0.6. Because that's still pretty bright. Maybe 0.65 on that one. 0.6 will work. Okay. That's good enough. I don't want to spend too much time tweaking this. I've already spent more than I probably should have. But we're just gonna select all of these and press Control G now. And scroll up there. And basically we just put these into a group. And we'll name this group Grass. And this just makes it a lot easier to scatter these objects over the plane that we created. So I'm going to merge these windows because we don't need those anymore. I'm going to save my blend file before I go any farther. And now all we have to do is scatter those blades all over this ground plane. So we're going to come over here to the particle systems, particle settings, and going to add a new particle system, and we're going to name it Grass. Change the type from emitter to hair, even though we're not using these actual hair strands. Going to turn on advanced settings, and then we're going to come down here to group and load the grass group. And as you can see, it's already oriented in the right direction and everything. They're standing up. Sometimes when you load these groups, the grass blades might be sideways or something like that. If that happens, what you have to do is you have to check that rotation option right there, and then go into your layer and rotate these grass blades 90 degrees along like the x-axis and the y-axis and the z-axis, and just keep rotating them in different directions until you figure out what direction it is that they need to be rotated in. So that looks pretty bad actually, but we can mess with that a little more. Right off the bat, I'm going to increase this to 10,000 just so we have a better idea of what we're working with. And before I forget, I'm going to change this from GPU to CPU. Because I have had it crash when I'm recording video tutorials and trying to use my video card to render at the same time. So I want to make sure we switch that. And basically what we want to do from here, the most important setting that you can work with when you're doing these grass blades, scattering them all over the plane, is this random setting right here. Because right now, as you can tell, they look really uniform. Part of that are these settings up here. If we turn this to random and uncheck even distribution, that already looks a little more random than it did before. but they're all sort of angled in the same direction, and it looks kind of weird. So if we bump up this random value right here, right off the bat, they start rotating in totally different directions, and it looks much, much, much better. And basically, whoa, don't want to adjust that. We just want to kind of mess with that random value a lot until we get something that we're happy with. Another really important factor are these two factors down here, the size and the random size. I'm actually going to increase the size to like 0.1 just because I don't want to have that scale when we're working with grass, just because the bigger the grass blades are, then the less of them you have to put on there. So I'm actually going to try 0.125 just for the sake of, I'm actually going to go all the way up to 0.15 just for the sake of this tutorial, so we don't have to add as many grass blades. I might go up a little higher than that. Okay. And the random size factor is also very important. That is exactly as it says. It gives the grass blades random sizes. And that helps a lot in making it look a lot more random. Okay, so that looks pretty good. I'm going to try to position my camera now, just to see if I can sort of... And we want to move the camera. Remember, our sun lamp is off to the right here. We want to move the camera so that it kind of captures the translucency of the grass blades. So I'm going to sort of get a little behind the plane here and kind of move that around just to get something sort of like that. Let's see how that goes. Okay. We're going to need more grass blades than that, though, so I'm going to actually hide this particle system, and I just did that by clicking the little eye icon there, and I went to the modifiers panel to find that. And I'm going to increase the number of particles from 10,000 to 25,000. Alright, and it's probably going to take a little while to render, especially since if we want it to look good, I'm going to have to adjust these settings with the 25 samples. So I'm just going to pause the recording and come back. Alright, so this is the result we get. It looks really, really saturated, so I'm probably actually going to go back and kind of change that a little bit, because it looks almost, I don't know, doesn't look as realistic when you give it too much saturation. I'm almost wondering if our random values are turned up too high, so I'm going to kind of decrease that back down to around 0.02. Maybe even add a little more random size in there, bring that all the way up to 1, because that really does help. And yeah, I'm actually going to go over to this layer then again and kind of work with this a little more and split my view again, go back to the node editor up here. I just want to kind of decrease that saturation a little bit, because that is really high. Maybe down to 0.15 instead. Oops. 1.5, not 0.15. Okay, so we'll merge these together again. And, you know, I could probably also add a little more of an orange tint to our sun. Okay. Alright, so I'm going to render that again really quickly. Alright, so that looks a little better. We need to add more grass blades now, because I think it was when I basically moved the random size all the way up to 1, then some of them started to disappear a little more. But you can see the translucency is definitely working. So you can really see this translucent effect going through these grass blades, how they get kind of darker towards the bottom because the light can't reach them as easily. So that's pretty good. So the next thing we want to do, basically this is it for the grass itself. We might sort of tweak the colors a little bit, the saturation, and maybe things like that a little more. But as far as the grass blades themselves, that's really all we have to do. However, there are a couple other things we can do to make this a little more interesting. Like we could add dead leaves, and we could add weeds, and other things like that. I want to keep this tutorial relatively short, and I'm already at about half an hour, I think. So I'm just going to demonstrate on one of those things, and I believe that'll be clover. But basically, we can go ahead and add a couple additional objects to scatter across this plane. So I'm going to go over to this layer again, the layer that we have the grass blades on, and I'm just going to add a plane. And basically I'm going to split my view here, go to the image editor again, and I am going to open another texture that I have. And again, this is another one that I took. Just grabbed a couple pieces of clover and weeds and other things like that from my yard and took photos of them, put them all together in one texture, and that is this image right here. And again, I'll also provide access to this on the site and everything. But you can see we have two little pieces of clover there. And basically, all we've got to do is map this plane to those images. And then remember how I was sort of talking earlier about how we wanted to keep the object origin point down there at the bottom of the grass blade, because that's where the object, starts to come up from the ground plane from. We have to use that to our advantage with the clover. So basically we would put that orange dot, the object origin, like really far down here, so that the clover would essentially be hovering above the ground plane. And of course it's not really hovering above the ground in real life, but we don't really have to add a stem or anything like that to the clover because it's going to be hidden pretty well by the grass. So I'm just going to go into edit mode, press U to unwrap, and sort of stretch it a little bit there. I'm going to kind of squash it in a little more. And I'm just going to scale this down so that it's about the size of that piece of clover right there. And then I'm going to split my view here as well. And I'm going to go to the node editor and add a new shader. And we're going to name this Clover. We'll name it Clover 1 actually, because we are going to have those two. We'll just name it Clover because they're in the same image, so we don't have to worry about different images and whatnot. And then I am just going to add an image texture there and load it there, drop that in there, go over to textured view, and there we go. Looks pretty good. However, this is different from the grass blade in that if we go into rendered view, you can see we got a problem, and that is we have this huge, ugly black color all around the clover that fills up the rest of the plane. And of course, we don't want that. So to get rid of that, basically I've just created a simple mask that we can use to hide that, so I can zoom out a little bit here. Basically what we want to do is we want to add another image texture, and we're going to open that texture's mask image right there, which is just a mask that I made for that exact image. It's the exact same size, everything like that, so we don't have to worry about differences in maybe UV mapping because it should work perfectly. And I just want to add a transparent shader. And I'm going to mix that with this diffuse shader using this image as the factor. And I think I actually need to flip those around. So basically what that means is it's using the black and white in that image to tell where the image is opaque and where it's not. So in this case, I think if I open this up a bit, when we render it, then we'll see that the white means that this diffuse shader is going to show through, and wherever there's black, then this transparent shader is going to show through. And of course, since it's transparent, we're not going to see anything there. So if I did this right, then yeah, as you can see, we now have just the clover without the black border around it, or all the black surrounding it. So that's pretty good. Then the only other thing we want to do is we want to mix. We should have done this beforehand actually, because we want to make sure we do this with this diffuse shader. Is we want to kind of mix that with a translucent shader, and that is translucent, not transparent. So just keep that in mind, and we'll drag that image input into there. And it's very important that you do this in the node setup before you get to the mixing of these, because otherwise you'll get the ugly black color around the edges back, and it doesn't look good at all. Okay, that's pretty good. We want to adjust the brightness a little more, though, probably. So I'm just going to go to brightness and contrast, just like that. Whoops, it's not going to work, clearly. Made a mistake there. Alright, then I guess I will add brightness and contrast node right there. No, apparently that doesn't work either. Right. We've got to add it before the image, I guess. So I'm just going to move these over and add a brightness and contrast node there. And hope that it actually works this time. There we go. Okay. And then I'm just going to increase the brightness to 0.2, maybe the contrast to like 0.4 or something, maybe even 0.5, something like that. Okay, and then I'm just going to duplicate that and apply the same thing to the translucent side of it, which looks pretty good. And then one other thing I'm going to do to the translucent side of things, sort of like we did with the grass blade, is I'm going to add a hue and saturation node, connect those, And I'm just going to bump up that saturation to like 1.5. And yet it affected the top too. Not sure why it did that. I don't know. It's too strong anyway. We want like 1.1, maybe even 1.2. That'll work. Okay. Finally done with that. Then the next thing we want to do is, of course, like I said, go into edit mode, and we want to... Whoa. Really bumped the microphone stand there. We really want to move this up above that object origin point. We don't know exactly how far yet. It's going to be sort of a matter of trial and error. We'll have to sort of compare it to the grass blade height and everything. We'll just leave it at something like that for now. Then I'm just going to duplicate that. I should probably name these. Press N to pull off that properties panel again, and we'll name this Clover 1 and Clover 2. Alright, and this will use the same material. We basically just want to go into edit mode and move this up so that it uses this other clover instead, just so that we have more variety. And then if we go into rendered view now, we can see that, yeah, it's using the two different clovers there, and it looks pretty good. Okay. So now what we want to do is we want to combine these into one group. Again, that's selecting both of them, which is right-clicking and then shift right-clicking and Control-G. And we want to name this Clover. Okay. This layout is a mess right now, so I'm going to merge all those windows, save that again. All right. I'm going to, for the sake of trying to figure out how high the clover is supposed to be compared to the ground plane, I'm going to lower this number down to like 1,000, just so that we can make it visible here without it slowing down our viewport. And the only reason we're doing this is so that we have sort of a visual guide as to where we're supposed to put the clover. Okay, so now all we have to do is add a new particle system, change the type to hair, enable advanced, go down to group, and load clover. And of course, I meant to name this Clover as well. Okay. Alright, as you can see, we're sort of running into the problem that I was talking about last time with the grass blades, where they're sideways. So what we want to do is check rotation, and what that does is it'll then use the rotation of the clover in this layer. And then we want to select these and start rotating them around random axes until we've got what we want. Clearly, we don't have to rotate it around the z-axis, because that would just sort of rotate them 90 degrees already in the angle that they are now. So we've got to rotate them around either the y or the x. So I'm going to start with the x, rotate them around the x-axis 90 degrees. That's not it, because they didn't flip up. So we want to rotate that back, our x negative 90. And clearly then it is along the y-axis, so we want to do r, y, 90. And yep, there we go. It's actually a pretty good length, too. So if we sort of come in here and do the same thing we did with the grass blades, check random, uncheck even, sort of mess around with that random factor there as well. Then kind of adjust that random size, just so we've got some that are sort of sinking even farther below. And we want to make it bigger too, because right now it's pretty small. Something more like that. Alright, but yeah, now we really have to move those down. So as we can see, they're pretty high up. Whoa, where'd it go? There it is, okay. They're a little too high, obviously. Yeah, they're way above the grass blade, so we want to sort of move those down. So just to do that, go back to this layer, go into edit mode, and we'll kind of move this back along the x-axis. Just like that. So that now if we look at it again, yeah, it's pretty good. Maybe even a little farther, though. Something like that. Okay, that's good for now. We might tweak it later on, but that'll work for now. Then there's one other thing I want to do, because I think I'm kind of starting to run out of time here. And that is, this is all sort of clumped together, or it's all scattered in pretty evenly over the entire plane. But what we want to do to make it even more realistic is to add like little clusters of it in some areas. So to do that, we want to go into weight paint mode, and I'm going to hide that particle system there. And I'm going to hide the other one too, just for the sake of hiding all of them. And basically what we want to do in here is we want to make sure that our weight is set to 100, and then sort of adjust the radius. And essentially we just sort of want to paint around this plane kind of the areas that we want clover. So basically we're painting either where we do want clover or where we don't want clover. We can control that later on. But we just want to paint a couple little clusters like I just did here. Maybe a little more like that. And then maybe switch tools and use the blur tool and kind of use that in some of these areas to, there we go, something like that. Doesn't have to be perfect, just sort of something random like that to kind of scatter it up a bit. Go back to object mode, make both of these visible again, and with the clover particle system selected, we want to scroll all the way down here to, I believe it's not field weights, that's right, it's vertex groups. And we want to load that group. I should have named it, actually. We're going to name it just to make a practice out of doing that. Just control-click it, and we'll name it clover. Alright, and now we can load that clover group. And as you can see, it's scattered the clover accordingly. It looks like it put it where we painted. And then if we wanted to put it where we didn't paint, then we just click that button right there to negate it. But that looks pretty good. Yeah, so I am going to hide both of those again and move the grass particle number all the way back up to, we'll say 35,000 this time. And I'm going to save this. And I am going to run a quick render of that, and I'll pause the recording. Alright, and that's the result. Looks really, really, really green. Guess just because we haven't put in any other things to sort of break it up a little bit more. But the clover looks pretty good. Looks pretty flat. I might sort of go in and add a little more variation and rotation. But yeah, I think that's going to be it for this tutorial. Some suggestions that you can use to take it a little farther. Sometimes I add some dead grass blades. I just use those regular grass textures and then adjust the colors a little bit and the saturation and whatnot, just to give it a little more variety so it's not all so green. And then in that texture that I'm going to be attaching to the site, as well as the clover, I also add a couple leaves from another kind of weed and a picture of a dead leaf. And scattering dead leaves across planes of grass like this really helps to sell the realism. So you would use essentially the same methods we did on the clover. You would just take a plane, maybe subdivide it fractally like we did with the main plane that we put the grass on here, and then unwrap it and sort of scatter it the same way we did with the clover. Just a couple ideas, something like that, to kind of give it a little more variety and a little more realism. But I hope you got something out of this basic part of the tutorial, and yeah, I'd love to see what you come up with. So that's all. Thanks for watching.